Welcome to Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of Web3 security, compliance, and risk. Join Michael Pearl as he interviews executives from across the Web3 industry to uncover the challenges and opportunities of this rapidly evolving space. Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by CyVers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. CyVers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit CyVers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 Watchdogs podcast. And today we have with us Tanisha Katara. Tanisha is a senior advisor to several prominent companies in the Web3 space, and primarily to Polygon. She has published several papers and op-eds on the issue of blockchain governance and the procedures that are adjacent to it. She's also a marketing and reputation management expert with many, many years of experience in that field. So I'm really, really excited to have you here, Tanisha, and perhaps we can just dive in. You have a very elaborate background. You are involved in so many projects. So please just tell us about yourself beyond what I've just mentioned.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. My consulting work essentially spans from multiple facets of the Web3 space. So it focuses on governance, crypto economics, product strategy. I've led go to market strategies for DAO tooling companies like DAO Lens, where we solve for critical gaps in DAO onboarding. Before that, I was full time with a crypto native bank where I led strategic initiatives that help bridge the gap between traditional finance and cryptocurrencies. Currently, one of my clients with Polygon, I focus on governance innovation. My most recent initiative is launching the Governance Hub, a platform that is designed to streamline and decentralize decision making processes. Additionally, my work within other data availability client extends to incentive design and crypto economic models. Overall, my consulting work is centered around aligning governance, strategy, and economics to to make sure that projects can thrive in the decentralized ecosystem.
Very interesting. So let's dive into the first word that you've mentioned, the first buzzword, governance. I would argue that it's probably one of the lesser known fields in the industry. Everyone knows about, tokens and token economy and even incentives that you've mentioned. But governance is perhaps kind of more obscure. Can you briefly explain what does blockchain governance mean and how it actually works?
Of course. So essentially, it's a set of rules and processes that guide decision making in any network. Like in traditional companies, decisions are made by executives or board of directors. But blockchain governance focuses more on openness and community inclusiveness to make sure that decisions are thought through with the stakeholders. These could be your token holders, your NFT holders, your gamers. So blockchain governance, I sometimes say this, it's like orchestrating a game of code and consensus, where decisions are encoded in the system. We call them smart contracts, but they're agreed upon collectively. We call that consensus. Now, blockchain governance, to be more practical, it can be broken down into several key areas. Let's say like grants and public goods funding, right? What is that? That involves allocations of funds to projects that benefit the network as a whole. These could be, audit bounties. These could be developer grants. These could be research initiatives or infrastructure improvements. Sometimes communities vote on where public good funds should go. Sometimes there are committees that vote on the allocation of resources. Then you have contract upgrades in any network. So decision around updating or upgrading smart contracts. Governance mechanism help determine how these upgrades are proposed, how are they reviewed, how are they implemented. You also have protocol governance, right? So this is where You'd cover stuff like how validators and nodes are included in the network. How are their reward structures made? One of the topics that we've been brainstorming a lot in protocol governance is slashing conditions. What should be the slashing conditions?
Can you
How?
elaborate what this means, slashing conditions?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So slashing condition is like when a node operator behaves maliciously, right? Like if I'm a node operator and I'm trying to like game the system, there are areas where you can check on chain that, hey, this node operator has been off chain for far too long. You know what? Let's slash him. So whatever funds that node operator has staked with the network is at that point slashed. There are attributable slashes, there are non-attributable slashes. But right now, for the sake of governance, let's only speak about attributable slashes. So double signing is one attributable slash. Not having liveness and being off chain is another example of attributable slash. You can attribute this on chain to a very clear data point. There's no subjectivity. So governance also helps in identifying, creating a monitoring system, setting thresholds for slashing conditions for node operators. And that's what we classify all of that into like the core protocol governance.
Being a lawyer, it sounds like a major headache. I mean, the governance in the traditional corporate world is a very, very complex thing, right? But there, it's people, entities, legal entities, and so on. And here, given the fact that it's so global, everything is on chain, oftentimes you don't even know what's the identity of some of the members. It sounds like a major headache.
It is. And this is why there's a very heavy focus on how you register a DAO or how you set up an entity in Web3. It's not as simple as just going on the internet and creating a blockchain or like creating a website and getting started. If it is in fact a registered company, you start creating committees and councils that are more with a very defined scope, and then kind of create the economics around it. In some ecosystems, in fact, validators have to go through a KYC process, like a process where an identity palette is set and they get rewards for setting up the identity palette. I know it's very anti the decentralized ethos, but people are trying to find a really nice balance between identity and privacy. And zero knowledge is playing an amazing role there. So I'm very optimistic about that.
Yeah, can you say a few words about zero knowledge for the sake of the listeners who might not know this term?
Yeah, of course. So zero knowledge is a very interesting piece of technology, and whatever I'm going to explain is going to be really layman. It's got a lot of interesting cryptography and compression to it, but essentially it's, if I had to put it in very simple terms, let's say that you want to prove to me that you are Michael, but you don't want to share your social security with me because, well, it's social security, you don't just share it with anyone. Zero knowledge allows you to essentially show that you're one real human. So you put your social security. It's not stored necessarily on any place. Think of it as that it's going to burn in like 3 seconds. And when things are not really stored, there's no concept of really hacking it or using it for malicious things. So what I'm doing is I'm abstracting.
Or copying it.
Exactly. So if this person is a real human, it's a real identification. This is Michael, he's 18 years above. I don't store any other information. It's compressed very beautifully and succinct. We call them succinct proofs. We create this proof, and so it's verifiable. Like, this is one real human. You can compute that verifiability, but you can't see the actual details that, this is the social security number and stuff like that. So it abstracts away your identity from your data. And that's like a very powerful thing that ZK brings.
Very interesting. So let's talk about, you mentioned a few, let's say, decision-making processes. And obviously, just to give you an example, like you mentioned, upgrading and perhaps like gas fee management, things of that sort. But perhaps the most intriguing one is basically, how do you manage treasury funds, right? How do you allocate grants? How do you decide, let's say, to hire some third-party supplier for a specific task? I guess this is a very sensitive topic. Can you give us like a quick overview of the process here?
Of course. You're right, it is a pretty complex project and everything is very customizable, right? And so managing a blockchain treasury is not just about allocating funds, it's about optimizing resources while navigating variables like inflation control, funding models, community engagement. Smaller DAOs typically have needs where they want to be able to control their inflation a bit more tightly. They want to have a funding model that does bring community engagement, but not at the cost of security. So let's break this down with real world examples. Now, budget allocation. The first example that comes to my mind is a network called as Polkadot. Polkadot's treasury is a community driven treasury. It allocates funds to projects that benefit the ecosystem. These proposals are submitted by the community and they're voted on by the council and the token holders. So it's like a dual model where they have a committee and also the token holders kind of participate in it. Now, these typically speaking, Polkadot's treasury comes from block rewards, right? Which directly impacts the token supply. And so to prevent inflation, like I was mentioning, you have to navigate variabilities. It's not as simple. To prevent inflation, these unspent funds are periodically burnt so that there's efficient fund usage, there's healthy token like pricing and budget allocation. Then comes grant management, which is a next step once you have your budget allocated and you're able to manage your inflations. The example that comes to my mind is the Ethereum Foundation's ESP, the Ecosystem Support Program. They fund projects aligned with Ethereum goals. There are proposals that are evaluated based on potential impact. The funds are released in milestones. So every time you hit a certain milestone, you commit to a milestone, you hit it, and they're like funds released. So sometimes you see quadratic funding models that are being used to allocate grants in a way that gives smaller projects a fair shot by emphasizing the breadth of support over the size of contribution. So you'll see like a lot of like different grant management designs. And then also comes that layer of transparency because, okay, you're allocating grants, but how do I know you're allocating it to the right people? So MakerDAO is a very good example when it comes to giving you a really good record of all transactions that are done on chain. Where did it go to? Who are these people? Setting up that identity palette, showing those milestone based rewards. So, yeah, that's the second part of your question, which is the grant management aspect of it.
Yeah, you've mentioned basically handling funds, a lot of sensitivity, a lot of complexity, tons of endpoints. And, being in the Web3 cybersecurity space, I hear many, many, many vulnerabilities that can be tricked. So perhaps you can dive into the security aspects of it. What are I mean, we all know, let's say in the more traditional, DeFi space or even CeFi space. I mean, coming from CyVers, we publish on a daily basis hacks where essentially the end goal is to steal funds, right? But
Right.
how does it work with the DAO? If I'm a hacker, why
Mhm.
should I, take advantage of a vulnerability and hack into a DAO? And what can I gain from that? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And is there different kind of attacks with different kind of motives? Like if we go one by one, Sybil attacks. Now, what is a Sybil attack for those who may not have context? They occur when a malicious actor tries to create multiple fake identities to manipulate votes. Now, we recently published a research paper where we found that what are these majority of proposals in Curve and Polkadot? Like almost 80% of proposals are financially beneficial proposals. They benefit a certain stakeholder. It could be token holders, it could be a certain person looking for a grant. It's looking like all of like 80% are related to some form of financial incentive gain. Now imagine that a Sybil attack could happen where an attacker can gain enough influence, they can sway the proposals in that favor, resulting in decisions that undermine the network's quality. One big attack that we see is we kind of consider when we're designing governance systems as Sybil attacks. And now we're having mechanisms like quadratic voting, reputation, proof of identity. they kind of make it harder for attackers to kind of control multiple identities. Then you have the most popular 51% governance attack. Now, in a governance system where you design voting power based on token holdings, any malicious entity can accumulate 50% of the tokens and control the outcome of these votes. Pretty scary outcome, but you have like really good mitigation strategy like delegated voting systems. It's something we've just also introduced at Polygon, where you have where you can reduce the risk of a single entity taking control. You implement time delays for critical proposals. You diversify your token distribution by using delegated voting systems and bringing in some of the best delegates and then kind of convincing people that, you can delegate to these folks. The more spread across, the better. So, yeah.
But let's say you have a delegated voting system, and eventually I manage to hack into 1 or 2 or 3 wallets of those delegates. Essentially, I can trick the system and I can reach the 51%, right?
Yes. So we have some risk mitigation layers there. One, we have time lock, which means that if we see some vote swaying or some very irregular behavior where there's some form of collusion or dynamic, it immediately like alerts us. And then we have a step-in mechanism where we ask other delegates. Now, these might be smaller delegates, sure. They might not be as powerful as the whales. They come together and very beautifully orchestrate during that time lock. And for regular changes, our time lock's pretty large. It's 10 days. So, we're able to come together. We're able to kind of orchestrate an opposition to that vote swing, which is also pretty large enough. Now, we've seen our distribution, and safe to say that 51% is not accumulated in the hands of just 3 or 4 voters. The second mechanism we have, and which is very important, is a layered structure where we have a multi-sig called as protocol council. It's a 13-member multi-sig. And then you have community voting, and then you have multi-sig again. So it's like a sandwich. Now, why did we do this sandwich? Let's say that for whatever reason, somebody becomes insanely powerful and tries to take 50% of the votes. Possibility, right? Like rare, but still a possibility. The final execution is tied to the protocol council, which means that, sure, you can signal an attack, but you can't execute an attack.
Yeah, you still have a man in the middle that can essentially stop it.
Exactly. And then to add to it, you also have an exit window. So let's say that you and I are token holders. We're just looking at this grand attack happening. Before something gets executed on chain, you and I have a 3-day window to exit the system, which is all going to be notified in real time. So you'll know exactly when to exit it, which is also a very powerful way for token holders to look out for themselves in such attacks.
Yeah, but from my experience in CyVers, and after seeing thousands of attacks, what you usually see, there's a saying, when there's a will, there's a way, right? And essentially, the more funds or the more power a DAO is holding, or let's say the more funds a wallet is holding, you will find that player that will know how to trick the system. Eventually, it's all a matter of an ROI, right? I mean, you deploy sufficient amount of developers and maybe some hardware, and eventually you will learn how to do it. So I'm guessing, not knowing too much about the DAO space, I'm guessing that eventually, if somebody has a goal of tricking a DAO, he will manage to do that, especially if there's a conglomerate or even a country behind them with the sufficient funds for it.
I completely agree. And we've seen cases of these, right? Like you've seen a social engineering attack that happened with the Ronin network, which is the Ethereum sidechain by Axie Infinity. Or you take front-end manipulation attacks that happened with WazirX recently. But the point being that, yes, there are these exploit, or even the compound bug in 2021, where there was a smart contract exploit that I think accidentally released $80 million worth of comp tokens due to a bug. So, I mean, these things can always exist. But the best you can do is create these layers, create opportunities for one honest actor to step in and kind of safeguard the system. And that's what, at least when I'm designing governance systems, I'm always creating plan B, plan C. and kind of separating execution from signaling. Like the community can signal, but the execution has to be extremely safeguarded, audited, tons of like layers there. If what happens when that fails? Oh, you have a security council that can pause a bridge, not lose further. Like sure, you're not going down like a whirlwind where you lose 80 and then you lose 100 and then you lose 180. Like you're able to stop it at some extent and mitigate risk. So while we can't do risk, like completely risk avoidance, given how new the space is and we're still figuring it out, there's risk mitigation that 100% can be done. So yeah, the focus is risk mitigation.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that there's kind of a tension, or you need to balance at the end of the way, at the end of the road, between the complexity and the security and the ease of use, right? Because you don't want decisions to take too long and to be too complicated, and eventually the system can be just stuck and nothing will be done.
Right. Yeah, I think at some points I would also argue, and maybe this is a bit controversial, I would argue that pausing a bridge to secure users' funds, I know compromises user experience by a huge margin, brings in a panic frenzy, but honestly speaking, sometimes it is the need of the hour, right? And you will find yourself as you grow in blockchain, you will often find yourselves having to choose between these choices. There's no easy way out. There's nobody who can absolutely say, you know what, I'm going to give you a great user experience, and when there's emergencies or security threats, I will also make sure your funds are safe. You can't give both promises. If you're going to keep it safe, you need a pausability feature, like to pause the bridges. When you pause the bridges, of course user experience is going to get affected. But make careful choices, because I would any day choose the security of my users, my community, over perhaps the user experience at this point. So I think it's safe to say that, yeah, it's going to be a tough choice, but it's a choice we will all have to make.
We see in our internal data that the average time for a company to actually figure out that it's being hacked is about 4 hours. And just to give you an example, you mentioned WazirX, and CyVers was the one that uncovered this hack, and we made the call to the founder. And I would guess that it would take them at least 3, 4, maybe even 5 hours before they would find out. Whereas the average hack takes up to 1 hour, right? Oftentimes it only takes seconds. So how does it work in a DAO? How important is it to know in time that somebody tries to trick the system through a hack or some exploit of a vulnerability?
That's a great question. So the answer depends on two design choices. If your design choice is to be more off chain and have execution very separate from signaling, in that scenario, sure, you could take some time, unless there is a massive vulnerability on the execution side. So if your design choice is more off chainish and then like having execution on chain, and there's assuming no vulnerability on the on chain part of it, sure, 4 to 6 hours where it's some form of signaling, vote swaying, vote buying, bribery can be a mistake we can afford. But I completely agree. Like if your design choice is more on-chain governance and on-chain execution, and there's a very strong vulnerability there, or even the minorest vulnerability that could be leveraged, I think 4 hours is not a time, the luxury that we can afford, given like how fast you can drain a bridge in that time. Like it's like a spiral, right? Like so the faster you're able to kind of pause it, kind of save users funds ASAP, is kind of very critical. And that's why even in governance, we need this very strong anomaly detection, right? Where you see like there's some very weird accumulation of voting power happening, which is not typical. It's beyond a certain normal threshold. And highlighting that ASAP gives the governance team, the protocol council, the multi-sigs, the committees, the councils be on their toes and be like, we need to look at this more carefully. And that's a very powerful way to do something.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things that we do with our clients, obviously as a company that is dealing with real-time monitoring and anomaly detection, I think one of the most important things is to just sit down and figure out what are your worst case scenarios and to prepare for them, right? The capabilities of monitoring solutions are immense, but you also need to know what to look for, right? And you need to plan the system in a sense that you know what are your vulnerabilities, and what you don't know, but you can still put some guardrails for it. And the most important thing is response mechanisms. As you said, eventually you need to know what you're doing, preferably in an automated way, once something goes wrong.
Right. 100%. And I think we're having these security multi-sigs in place, right? Where we know that if something goes wrong, there's a very tiny niche that of multi-sig that can, and maybe a lot of people do say it's centralized, and it is because we don't have a better solution at the moment, is to completely take control of what's happening and just freeze the whole thing until we find a way out. And then also letting your communities know very transparently, like, this has happened. And don't worry, we're going to get there. In so many attacks, I've also found the postmortem to be very bad. Like, there's no idea of what's happening, who to trust, who's the hacker. There's fake news around. There's an entire crypto Twitter going crazy, and this panic. And so, yeah, you're right. Like, both from a multi-sig controls, access management to how you communicate becomes very critical thinking pieces in such scenarios.
Yeah, I'm so happy you've mentioned the postmortem, because that's, people don't realize that it's one of the most, challenging periods of time, because if it's not enough that you lost funds, or maybe, a vote, a very important vote was tricked, you also have to figure out, where the funds went, and oftentimes you can't, but if you can reverse it. And also, let's be honest, who to blame, right? At the end of the day, you need to figure out, because you also have, and that's also one of your expertise, you also have a reputational crisis, right? And you have to manage it. And this can spiral into basically destroying the company or the DAO. So it's really, really important to have in place, again, preferably automated mechanisms that can actually do the investigation and can actually show you what went wrong, where the funds went to, what was the root cause of that hack that you just encountered. So I totally relate with that.
Yeah, no, makes sense. You're right, and this is the best part of being on chain, right? Like, when things go right, you can see it. When things go wrong, you can also see it. But then you need someone who's sitting on top of that on-chain data and making sense of the trends and patterns there. So I think we still need to figure out the second part. And I'm glad CyVers. I think I did see your tweet when the WazirX thing happened, where you instantly put out. I think that's we really need more of that, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. Blockchain is rich of data, perhaps, one of the richest industries out there in terms of data, which is transparent, and, you can access it from anywhere. But the most important thing is the context, right? You have to figure out what this data means, and to find the right patterns. And that's where basically AI-based anomaly detection comes in and helps you to figure this out, and also in a very, very fast and accessible way.
Yeah. So there was this one project at DevCon that we were discussing yesterday. Can we build a multi-sig transparency dashboard for all ecosystems? So you're literally seeing all, because let's face it, these multi-sigs are controlling millions in security and maybe even billions. So can I just take the top 10 chains, every multi-sig they have, be it security multi-sig, treasury management multi-sig, can I create a dashboard and see who these participants are, see how they vote, how fast do they vote, and kind of hold them accountable if the need ever arises. Maybe that's the first step to kind of using AI and using on-chain data, fetching the right events and showing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Indeed, I mean, they have so much power, and you don't have to know their identity, speaking of zero knowledge, right? So you don't have to actually know who these people are. And oftentimes, as you said, there is a multi-sig to the multi-sig. So so it's not necessarily one person, but you do need to track their behavior, and again, to see if there are any anomalies in that behavior. And that could be a very good example, that a very good hint that something happened. Again, the WazirX hack, right? At the end of the day, you had 4 signers that managed to trick the system, and if only someone could have seen that there's an interaction with a malicious smart contract, and the signers are not behaving in that this transaction is not the typical behavior of the system,
Right.
this could have been prevented.
100%. I think lately there has been a lot of front end manipulation attacks, especially with multi-sig. So while you're building like good, Gnosis say, if you're doing it in closed doors, there's no time lock. There's no sense of like going back and rechecking. There's no scanner where I'm able to see what contracts being interacted with. And these are low-hanging fruits, which is such a shame, right? Like we can build these technologies. We're just not using it enough. And yeah, you're right. It's like it's sometimes a shame to see tons of people losing their life savings over things like these.
Yeah, so actually, the WazirExec and similar hacks basically triggered our team to build something like that. So we have what we call transaction firewall, which
Right.
essentially allows you, after, without going too technical, right? After the first signer has signed, you're sending the payload to CyVers. We're simulating the transaction, and
Right.
we're actually analyzing all the endpoints, all the smart contracts that the transaction goes through, and
Right.
we're assessing the maliciousness of the transaction and the outcome. So
Right.
eventually you can have a simple yes/no answer as per your policy and as per, our risk assessment, and you can, move on with transmitting the transaction, or it will be failed.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, that combined with time lock would be such a good feature, right? If you did have like a time lock mechanism where even if it was like a false positive or a false negative, that time lock allows, at least for regular changes and not emergency. I mean, emergency is a whole different treatment, but like for regular changes, a time lock combined with a detecting mechanism like this, a firewall like this, would be really powerful.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So we talked about, and speaking of Wazirex, we talked about reputation, right? And you're an expert on marketing and reputation. Can you elaborate a little bit about the reputational impact of a company that was hacked or whose DAO was tricked? Can you take us through that? Because we obviously see that on Twitter and some basic media coverage, but what's going on behind the scenes? What are the dangers of such a reputational crisis?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's go step by step, right? So what is the immediate impact? It's erosion of trust. So a major hack, particularly one that results in the loss of user funds or sensitive data, you immediately tend to lose trust. You will start seeing a spiral down on the internet, the sentiments going completely down. There's panic, there's fake news, there's a sense of feeling devastated, there's life savings being lost, there's a sudden spike in withdrawals. Now, for blockchain projects with token based economies, a significant hack will obviously result in a sudden drop in token prices because there's that loss of trust and confidence. So if you remember the Ronin network hack, the price of the Ron token like plummeted after a $620 million hack that was revealed. The news spread quickly, and like it's life savings and tokenomics, economic impact like that you see immediately. Now there's definitely like a long term impact that you'll see. Now you'll start seeing that it attracts the attention of regulators. Now this has not been good for our industry. I think we want to show regulators, policymakers, decision makers around the world that this is a technology that you can trust. The biggest long-term consequence we're seeing, and I think this was the case with the Bitfinex hack that happened in 2016. There's years of legal battles, years of public scrutiny. The regulators often like look with skepticism, and I think for me that's one big damage control that we need to do, because we are building good technology, right? This happens with innovations. When we went from from the barter system to cash, we saw there was a spike in thefts. When you move from cash to like cards, your debit cards and credit cards, there was a rise in digital theft. We keep getting better with these, and then now that same cycle is repeating with blockchain. But we still need to be really careful. Then you see reputation in the way you you kind of respond to crisis, and I'll be honest, there's a lot of companies can do better in the way they respond to crisis, like acknowledging the issue instead of trying to delay stuff. If not a blockchain example, but the Uber data breach scandal, there was a backlash that the company faced for hiding the incident, right? There was also issues with certain like external factors that happened with the Binance, where Binance was asked to take responsibility for a few live streams and social media things that went live without like that wasn't like the best in content. So definitely like in terms of like seeing some of these, or the way you respond to crisis, the way you build resilience, the way you compensate and restitute your users after these major hacks, the way regulatory and policy attention is kind of tampered when this happens, are some like examples where we can do better, and we have a long way to go.
I think you raised a very good point about the regulators. So at the end of the day, what the project and the company leaders need to understand that if we take your analogy from the more traditional finance space, at the end
Right.
of the day, where there are hacks, especially if there are retail investors involved, you're going to have regulators stepping in, and then instead of these company leaders taking the necessary repercussions in terms of security measures and so on, they will be forced to do that, and then it will be much more expensive for them and much more cumbersome, because when the government is involved, in the end of the day, they force you to do much more than you actually need. So I
Right.
think that the industry needs to grow up and needs to really step up to the moment to understand the danger here.
Yeah. And see, at the end of the day, right? Yeah, sure, there are harsh regulators, but let's face it, they're coming from the right place. They're protecting their citizens, they're protecting investors in an economy, which is their job. And I know that there have been some unwarranted attacks on the industry. Some of our biggest players have been called by regulators when really they've done nothing wrong. And we know it because we have it on chain. We're able to track things. But we need to find that balance where we can convince regulators that, look, we have these audit mechanisms, we have these safeguard rails, our technology will be robust. And at the same time, I think regulators also need to meet us halfway, where they're like, one attack or two attacks does not mean that the industry is bad, that it's malicious. And that's a very tricky balance to build.
Yeah, it's a very good point that you've mentioned with respect to the post-mortem, right? The ability to prove that you've done nothing wrong, or maybe that there was a mistake, or maybe that there is another perpetrator, like a third
Right.
party. If you don't have the proper tracking mechanisms, and again, we have that in the traditional finance, RegTech companies and so on, you will not be able to prove that in time, and then it's a spiral, as you said.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. That's true.
So, Tanisha, we're almost out of time. Any last words, anything that you want to say to the audience, perhaps about the future of DAOs and the security of DAOs?
Yeah, I think my one focus area is often community inclusiveness through governance. Like, it's something I think very deeply about, be it the way we work with multi-sigs, the way we build security. And I think a lot of people ask me, like, why does it need to be inclusive? Like, why are we having this conversation today where we're trying to balance out governance and security? I think for me, it's that when power is distributed, decisions are no longer made by the privileged few, but are shaped by those who are directly impacted. And it's not just about having a voice, it's about having a seat at the table. And so, one of the biggest challenges in governance today that I know a lot of us are facing because we're in this space is, how do we build systems that are community, like we including the community, but hey, we're not putting too much of our skin out because we don't want to lose control, or we don't want to like make sure it's not like very secure. This argument is something that's very tightly knit between security and governance. It's almost like a very strong tension that you can feel in all, no matter which company I work with. It's like an always a tension. Like, security is always coming from the right place. They're like, we can't do community inclusiveness just yet. It's too scary. Let's build multi-sigs. Governance is trying to move away from too many multi-sigs and trying to build something more inclusive. My answer to that tension is, I think after years we finally found like a good balance. You have layers of off-chain that you must leverage. They're powerful. You use adaptive quorum, use beautiful mathematics. And I urge the audience to read about adaptive quorums, delegations, the liquid democracy, the time locks, a separate route for regular, a separate route for emergency. Treat things differently. Like, don't have a one size fit all. And then have execution tied to a decentralized body that's not just made of your employees, but a little bit more of experts in this field, a few security experts, a few blockchain smart contract engineers. Have them on your seat at the table. Let there be like multi-sigs and let them take decisions, but let it be collaborative. That's my only food for thought based on the size of DAO.
And where can we read more about that? Can we follow you? Where are you most active? Which platform?
So surprisingly, I'm not very active on X, but I do update a lot of my writings on my website, which is www.tanishakatara.com. So you can definitely catch up.
We'll add this to the show notes so people can access it.
That's perfect. And thank you so much, Michael. I think this was a wonderful conversation and thanks for the opportunity. And I hope it helps. I hope that when people are designing governance, they're able to now look at both the security angles of it and the, inclusivity angle of it.
I have definitely learned so much from this conversation. Thank you so much, Tanisha. It was fascinating. And I think we'll meet again. We'll need to do a deeper dive on some of the issues.
100%. Yes, let's do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by CyVers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. CyVers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.